It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, June 20th, 2025. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I'm John Ramey. We are, in all transparency, recording this on Thursday afternoon, June 19th, and we will publish it just past the stroke of midnight on the 20th Pacific time. In this one, we will talk about the first week of the Iran-Israel war that began with a strike by Israel on Iran just before we recorded last week's episode. We will talk about the G7, in which the Israel-Iran conflict played, a big part. And we will also talk about the Fed. And the chairman has spoken. So buckle up. We'll start with the New York Times reporting that President Trump said Thursday, that is today, the 19th, he will decide whether the United States will attack Iran, quote, within the next 2 weeks, adding in a statement released by the White House that, quote, there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, end of quote. For days, Mr. Trump has mused publicly about the possibility of ordering American forces to bomb Iranian nuclear sites, suggesting that strikes could be imminent, while also insisting that it was not too late for talks. With his comments on Thursday, Trump appeared to opt for some breathing room to consider options that carry a lower risk of escalation. Thursday, today, the sixth day of the war, the Israeli military launched another wave of strikes against targets in Iran, including a nuclear complex. We have reporting on that. Israel's defense minister said the country would step up its attacks to, quote, remove the threats to the state of Israel, end of quote, after a barrage of Iranian missiles hit several locations, including a major hospital complex in southern Israel. One other note, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear watchdog, said an Israeli strike on a retired nuclear facility in Iran, in Iraq, Iraq, Iran, has caused damage to the plant there that produced heavy water used to moderate nuclear reactions and cool reactors. The potential for a radiological accident with the dispersion in the atmosphere of radioactive materials and particles, the potential for that is there, but no major radiological incident has resulted from the attacks. So all of that is, I don't know, Sam, terrifying. Yes. The United States is going to war, nuclear radiological leak potential. It's chaotic in 6 different directions.
Yes, although I'm glad that you led with the apparent 2-week or possible 2-week interim before any U.S. strike. Now, Trump didn't say that nothing would happen in the next 2 weeks, but that he would be making a decision within the next 2 weeks. But still, that appears to be a sort of step back from what really seemed yesterday to be an imminent U.S. attack. All throughout this week.
It just makes no sense, Sam. Like, Israel starts a war, and now Trump is like, all right, we got to get in on it, like out of seemingly nowhere.
Well, now, there's a lot going on, there's definitely a lot going on here. The problem is it's difficult to discern what those things are, right? Now, I think it's useful, perhaps, to back up all the way to April, when we recall Liberation Day, at which time Trump announced a whole just scad of really enormous tariffs on every single country in the world. And as it happened, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was due to arrive at the White House the following Monday anyway. And as we discussed on our show, he made a big show in the White House of saying that he would eliminate the Israeli trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States. And now, of course, that was ridiculous, but, the point is that he was very clear, very anxious, that is, to come to terms with the United States and not.
He wanted to say the thing that Trump wants to hear.
Exactly. Unfortunately, at the same time, Trump made a point during that same meeting in the Oval Office of mentioning that his administration was going to be conducting nuclear talks with Iran. And you could almost hear the sad trombone in reference to Prime Minister Netanyahu, right? It's like, here I am supplicating myself in front of you in reference to trade, and this is what I get. And yeah, that is what you get with Donald Trump. Sorry, and if you didn't know that by now, what are you, new here? But the point is that this was not what Netanyahu wanted. And so now we know that this Israeli operation against Iran had already been planned months and months ahead of that meeting.
Sure. I'm going to call a timeout real quick just to make sure we're airtight on this. Why doesn't Netanyahu want the United States to start nuclear talks with Iran? Is it simply because the United States has nowhere near the skin in the game that Israel does regarding Iran's nuclear program?
Well, now, I've never met the prime minister, so I don't know what his actual motivations might or might not be.
But we all understand the sad trombone component of that, right? He's kind of the odd man out, even though he's very interested and has more on the line than the United States, ostensibly, if Iran gets the bomb. That's
right. Now, some people might speculate that if the war in Gaza continues, Netanyahu's political support will continue to drain away. And in fact, opinion polls inside of Israel seem to show that a majority of the Israeli public has now turned against continuing the war in Gaza, which is new in that conflict. And so he needs something in order to be able to continue to stay in power. Because as we've discussed since the beginning of the war, he was under a lot of political pressure to begin with. Not least because of the enormous security failures that allowed Hamas to mount their atrocious attacks on October 7th of 2023.
So you mean the beginning of the Gaza war?
That's right. And so his only option, or not his only option, but a viable option for him would be to expand the war.
Start another one.
Mind you that he's said for years that the Iranian nuclear program needed to be eliminated. And as we discussed last week, this was his best opportunity, right? Before Trump had actually come to any final arrangement with Iran, the time to strike was last week. And we know that there were talks scheduled last Sunday, right? And so, as we discussed, it seems as though, and to use one of Trump's favorite constructions, many people are saying that that Netanyahu basically was trying to drag the United States into a war with Iran. Now, all through this week, at least until today, Trump was using the word "we."
We.
That is, we have total air superiority and stuff like this, seeming to indicate that the United States was involved in the war already. Wisely, I think, the Iranians didn't construct it that way, right? They have not attacked any U.S. assets, which are next door in Iraq, right? Right across the Gulf in Qatar, right? They've made a point of not bringing the United States in because they don't want to face America. It's bad enough facing Israel by themselves.
Okay, I have a question, Sam. If the United States and Iran are ostensibly conducting good faith negotiations about the Iran nuclear program,
which apparently they are,
how does that square with Donald Trump essentially saying we about the Israeli military campaign against the Iranians?
Well, again, many people are saying that he watched Israel begin to just clobber Iran. And
right. So he just wants to be on the winning side.
He wanted to be on the winning side. But there's an old saying that dates back to the first Trump presidency, which is that, and the question is, who's the most influential person in the White House?
Right,
and
the
answer is
talk to him.
Whoever, and the last person to talk to him, who today might have been, that is before the statement came out, that person might have been Steve Bannon, who did visit the White House today and is well known to be among the isolationist supporters of Donald Trump, as opposed to the more hawkish internationalists inside of his cabinet. Bannon, I think very wisely, has decided not to go to work inside the White House this time around, right? Because if you're not in the White House, you don't have rivals in the White House. You can sort of stay above, outside of the fray of what is, clearly a snake pit.
Okay. Again, I'm not. I believe the phrase is steel man. I want to steel man President Trump's approach here because, look, the G7 said it. Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. I agree with that.
In fact,
I agree with Israel's position on that, as much as I might disagree with other policies of that government and how they're conducting the war in Gaza. I agree with Donald Trump's position on that, as much as I disagree with how he conducts his government and his policies and his lawlessness. I just want to make sure that everybody is kind of operating in good faith on what seems to be one of the few good faith arguments we can all agree on, right? It's bad if a theocratic, fundamentalist, terrorist sponsoring government gets a nuclear weapon. So,
okay, John,
there's a rare consensus here.
All right. If you want to make sure everybody's operating in good faith, then you get the sad trombone music because
right, I'm the idiot.
In this exchange is doing that. Okay,
right. Which is alarming because the stakes are so high.
Okay, now one institution that we might say is operating in good faith is the International Atomic Energy Association,
the UN. The UN Nuclear Watchdog.
Yes, the IAEA, as they're known, headed up by Rafael Grossi. And Signor Grossi said, as we talked about last week, that Iran was now enriching uranium up to the level of 60%. Now, and he mentioned that there's no real legitimate civilian use of 60% enriched uranium. However, that's still not enough. That's still not weapons grade. Okay, so they've been at 60% for a few months, and so they have held there, right, during the time actually that they were negotiating with the Trump administration. So they were content to not further enrich uranium past 60% while negotiating. So they could not have broken out to a nuclear weapon at that point. Also, just having weapons grade uranium is not the same thing as having a full-on nuclear weapon. They could have They could have had a dirty bomb or some very crude device that they might have put on a ship or something like this. That's not really yes, that's a problem. It's certainly a nuclear threat, but it's not like having an international intercontinental ballistic missile program with nuclear warheads.
Or a B-52 with a bomb bay. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, and so they were not an imminent nuclear military threat. Okay,
and so I understand that.
And so for Israel to characterize them as such.
And they have been doing this for about 30 years now.
That's right. And they've been wrong that entire time.
Right.
And so.
Well, we should say Netanyahu has for about 30 years.
Sure. But the fact is, let's face it, in America, we have every right to see Iran as less of a threat than if you live in Israel. Right. So the idea of Iran being a threat is actually a nonpartisan political idea in Israel. Totally. So it's not really just Netanyahu.
But I meant as far as the exaggeration or maybe the inflation of the hyperbolic elements.
I guess, but that might just be because Netanyahu's been in power more than anybody else, right? I mean, if he's the only person who's ever prime minister, he's going to say that more times than any other person.
Either way, it's a much more salient political issue for Israelis than somebody in the G7, for example.
Absolutely. But I think we can at least be relieved that we're not going to be imminently involved in this conflict. Because if we were going to be, then I don't think Trump would have come out and issued this statement today, which, by the way, he did not do himself or even on social media. He had his spokeswoman, Caroline Leavitt, read the statement out loud off a piece of paper. And so I'm not even sure he wrote it, mind you. Right. But whether it was Steve Bannon or him, maybe Steve Witkoff, for example, we can imagine Steve Witkoff saying,
he's on the case.
Yeah, I've been flying all over the world all year, trying to make the deals that you want me to make, and suddenly Netanyahu comes in and you're going to just forget about all the, what am I working for, right? We don't exactly know. And so we can at least put on pause some of the ideas we might have had about how this play out. For example, to take it off a pause, my biggest fear was not an Iraq-style regime change, which, obviously when we think of regime changes, the first thing that comes to our mind is Iraq.
Yes.
Right?
Deadly, messy, disastrous.
Yes, and involving large numbers of American troops, which I think is the most important issue here. My fear was something more like Libya, right? And I saw Prime Minister Netanyahu on television today who said that he speaks to Trump almost every day, right? I can imagine Netanyahu saying something to him like, listen, when I talk about regime change, don't think about Iraq. Think about Libya. When Barack Obama
in 2011,
in 2011, at the behest of Great Britain and France, then under the respective rules of David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy, just bombed the hell out of Libya, and the resulting popular uprising ended up deposing and then killing the dictator Muammar Gaddafi. There were no American troops involved, and for that reason, you never hear about Libya today, right? I mean, by the way, Libya today is in terrible shape. They have not had a stable government since then, right?
Right, which is, as much as you might think losing Gaddafi is a net positive for the world, it's not worked out well for the Libyans.
No, or for that matter, any of their neighbors, including the European Union, which Libya has been the main transit point of the flood of migrants coming across the Mediterranean. But the point is, it's not been a problem for America. It's not something Americans ever think about, whereas the war in Iraq is something that people still, look back on with regret and, in some cases, shame. But I think, but that was my biggest fear, just to have a permanently destabilized Iran, right? For instance, Netanyahu himself said publicly that killing the supreme leader would end the conflict, which I think is just ridiculous all the way around, right? But, I mean, sure, maybe it would end it for you, right? But the point is...
Not for the 90 million people in Iran.
That's right. And I think that he had a Libya scenario in mind also, whereas if they killed the supreme leader, the whole place would just devolve into chaos, and there would be a succession struggle amongst the various factions of the remaining remaining Iranian government. But he could be wrong about that. Right? It could be that one faction takes over very quickly and everything just continues on, right? And so this is a terrible idea for many, many, many reasons. But I think that might have been the persuasive angle that Netanyahu might have been trying to adopt in his quasi-daily conversations with our president.
I mean, again, if you decapitate the theocratic rulers of Iran and there's a factional power struggle, any number, I presume, of those factions could do something rash and very destabilizing, like, as you mentioned last week, closing the Strait of Hormuz, right? And you might not even have a centralized person with whom to negotiate the reopening of it, right?
That's right. And
like, Iran is much more important, this is terrible to say, but is much more economically important to the rest of the world than Libya is. So
by far.
So if Iran had a Libya-like collapse, the effects would be felt much more severely globally.
They might be, at any rate. The point is, though, we don't actually know what would happen, right? And the unforeseen consequences would still be the responsibility of the powers that took part in it. And, for instance, Trump himself, speaking in Saudi Arabia not all that long ago, right, talked about how the age of intervention and regime change was over. And so, now, of course, Trump has no problem being on every conceivable side of any possible issue, right? I mean, he can change his mind on turn on a dime, right? But this would
especially when he thinks he can align himself with somebody who's going to win.
That's right. But this would be a big deal. And in a way, it ends up being a sort of international relations variant of the taco trade, right? And in which he went right up to the brink of what could have been an enormously catastrophic result and turned back at the last possible moment.
The war between Israel and Iran was a hot topic at the G7, the group of seven, according to Wikipedia, and also according to the world, but this is Wikipedia's language, an intergovernmental political and economic forum consisting of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and I suppose for the moment, the United States. It is because it is organized around Wikipedia's words, shared values of pluralism, liberal democracy, and representative government. That's why I say,
how's that working out for you?
Yeah. G7 members are major IMF and International Monetary Fund advanced economies. Started with an ad hoc gathering of finance ministers in 1973. Anyway, it was the G8 because Russia was part of it from 1997 until 2014. So that's the G7. Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US. The grown-ups in the room, if you will.
Sort of, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Reuters reporting yesterday, Wednesday. Group of seven nations expressed support for Israel in a statement, which is shocking given what other things the G7 and those nations have had to say about Israel. Issued late on Monday, labeled its rival Iran as a source of instability in the Middle East, with the G7 leaders urging broader de-escalation of hostilities in the region. Quote, "We affirm that Israel has a right to defend itself. We reiterate our support for the security of Israel," end of quote. G7 leaders said in the statement, quote, "Iran is the principal source of regional instability and terror," end of quote. The statement added that the G7 was, quote, "clear that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon." Now, there's a whole bunch of countries in the G7 who are not particularly charitable towards Israel generally.
Well, I think that might be a bit of an overstatement.
Okay,
right now,
at least lately, and for good reason, possibly.
Yes, but
the government of Israel.
That's right. But in other words, just because they disapprove of Israel's policies towards the Palestinians, as well they should, in my view, doesn't mean that they're suddenly on the side of Iran, right? The fact is, the Iranian regime is awful, and we should make sure we mention that. And we should also make sure that we reiterate that this entire aggression of Israel against Iran is illegal, just flat out.
That's actually why I was surprised the G7 issued the statement.
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
Such a clear statement.
Certainly.
Yeah.
In fact, the new Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, being interviewed at the G7, said that Israel was doing the dirty work for all the rest of us.
Yeah, shouldn't this have gone through the UN? Wouldn't that have been the case if the United States wanted to, I don't know, topple Iraq, right? Don't we remember 2 wars there where we at least played footsie with the UN and tried to give lip service to the international community and stuff?
Oh, okay, well, that's where the sort of comparison is a little weak. For instance, the G7 statement isn't binding. They didn't say they were going to do anything, all right? So they were going to have this meeting anyway. It's not like they convened it because of the war, right? But since the war, the attack on Iran took place days before the meeting, they had to say something. They couldn't just go, "Whoa, what's going on, guys?" And so they issued a statement that they could all agree on. Trump, in fact, left the meeting after one of the total of 2 days. So the sort of the G6.5, something like that, right? And so now I think, honestly, he left the meeting because there were a bunch of foreigners there, and he doesn't like that.
Maybe that's the Tale trade. Trump always leaves early.
Yeah, right. Or he also just...
he doesn't like foreigners, exactly.
He doesn't like multilateralism either, right? He'd rather talk to any of these people one-on-one, right?
And he doesn't like people smarter than him.
That's right. And so it's like, oh, gee, sorry, guys, I'd love to stick around, but, this thing came up with Israel, and I really got to go. Bye, and so he just leaves.
I mean, honestly, like a decent excuse.
Actually, it worked out well for him. And also, Zelensky was going to show up the next day, and I think he'd, probably rather not talk to him either, right? So this just worked out. But, now he's in the thick of it, and nobody actually knows I don't think he knows actually what he's going to do. And I think he's actually being relatively candid about that because he's got a bunch of options, but none of them are good. And he's got a bunch of people on both sides of intervention versus non-intervention, all of whom have very strong cases to make, which they are making both privately to him and in public.
And let's be candid, it would be catastrophic for his political coalition if the United States actively participated in this war. That's right. That would break up his coalition in a way
that's
that
why
few other things could.
Well, I don't know about break it up, but the point you're making is
I would test it.
Yeah, the point you're making is exactly why I think the Libya scenario is the most likely one, right? Just blow
no boots
out
on the ground.
No boots on the ground, and
kick over somebody else's anthill,
and then just walk away, right? Because Americans don't really care about foreign policy, right? And if we're not involved and there's no blowback, then it'll be okay, right? And people can just worry about tariffs and inflation and stuff like this, which is what they're worried about anyway.
I mean, it's terrible to say, but yeah, the American public would look the other way about 1 million Iranian civilian casualties if the U.S. casualty number was sufficiently low.
That's right.
That's horrific, but true.
When people think about Libya, when they think about Barack Obama, Libya is probably not in the top 10 topics that they associate with him. Right. But in its region, it was by far the most significant thing that happened under his watch. Right. And so it's, again, that's why I think it's the most important, that is the most likely outcome of this whole process. And I'm worried about that.
Okay. Anything else about the G7?
Not really. I mean, they did issue a statement, which apparently the United States did sign off on, condemning Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, which
really?
Which I guess if you're just in a hurry to leave, you're just like, yeah, sure, just
where do I sign?
Yeah, exactly. I got to go, right? Because at that
wasn't
point,
Trump famously cantankerous about not signing anything in his first term in one of these G7s?
Again, I think it's just the easiest thing to do, right? I mean, Trump is a very lazy person, right? He's just like, look, I just want to leave. If signing this piece of paper gets me out of here, and again. Okay, so I agreed to something. What? Because someone's going to hold me to that? I'm not going to renege on that later? I mean, he does it all the time.
Right. Okay, the Fed, monetary policy, central bank, real heart of the matter here. CBS reporting, the Federal Reserve said Wednesday it is holding its benchmark interest rate steady, marking a continuation of its wait-and-see approach as it assesses the impact of the Trump administration's economic policies. The central bank also expects inflation to worsen in the coming months, but it still foresees 2 interest rate cuts by the end of this year, the same as it projected in March. That seems slightly counterintuitive. Quote, for the time being, we are well positioned to wait and learn more about the likely course of the economy before considering any adjustments to our policy stance. End of quote. That is Fed Chair Jerome Powell speaking at a Wednesday press conference to discuss the rate decision. In its announcement Wednesday, the central bank, the Fed, mentioned solid labor market conditions and an economy that continues to grow at a, quote, solid pace, although it also signaled caution. The Fed wrote in its announcement, quote, uncertainty about the economic outlook has diminished but remains elevated. Is that because the wake from the Trump tariff onslaught has maybe settled a bit?
A little bit, but
for the moment.
I think it's mainly that we still don't know where that issue is going to land. For example, the 90-day pause on the tariffs is going to expire at the beginning of next month.
Yeah.
And so that's
July 8 or something, right?
I think it's July 9. All right. And so we're going to have to wait until then, and possibly even longer. Maybe there'll be another extension, like the 2-week extension that was granted now, or the 2 weeks that Trump granted to Vladimir Putin in terms of his negotiations earlier this year, which was never met. And so we still don't know how the tariffs are going to shake out. And that's one of the main sources of that uncertainty.
Okay, why is Powell giving Trump the cover then? We're still going to cut rates this year, probably.
because
why wouldn't he just take that off the table?
well, again, if things remain the way they are, right? And in some ways, he might be trying to say to Trump, look, just don't do anything, right? Which is, let's face it, your natural inclination anyway,
Yeah,
right?
right.
If you don't do anything, I'm not going to have to tinker with interest rates, right?
Or I'll
Now,
cut them, which will be good for you.
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I could, exactly. If you want the cuts, don't do
Chill
anything
out, man.
hasty, okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Now, I think that's a bit too subtle a level of messaging for Trump to actually pick up on, but perhaps somebody on his team might be able to get it. But Powell mentioned over and over again that we're in a pretty strong position, and he's right about that. But I think he's well aware, and he mentioned ongoing uncertainty, and I think what he meant by that was that the economic data is all over the place right now. There's so many conflicting signals that it's hard to pick through them all, right? And some of them sort of cut both ways. For instance, we're still adding jobs, but not very many, right? The GDP is still growing, but not very quickly, right? At the moment, sellers of houses outnumber buyers, right? So that might cause housing prices to fall, which would be good in the short term. However, if people aren't buying houses, then a lot of people will think twice about building houses. And I can go on and on and on about this, right? But the point is that when Powell talks about an ongoing environment of uncertainty, there's a lot of uncertainty in virtually every aspect of the economy. And I think that's sort of what he was getting at there.
I mean, it's like lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? You
Yeah.
could grab any one of these economic indicators and blow yourself
right.
into a full argument that is wrong.
And the other thing about it, which I don't think he even mentioned, was that oil prices have risen rather dramatically in the past week, as you might expect they would with the ongoing war in the Middle East. But if that war expands or even continues, those oil prices are going to start to feed through to the rest of the economy in an inflationary way. Right now, energy prices are generally excluded from core inflation because they're volatile and they don't have an immediate impact on other aspects of the economy. But if they're sustained at an elevated level for a long period of time, then they'll eventually exert more and more inflationary pressure on the economy as time goes on. And I think he was wise to not actually bring that up at all, right? Because by the time the Fed has their next meeting, this whole thing could be put to bed, right? And there's no point in actually spooking markets about it, spooking investors about it before then.
Powell also, this is CBS again, underscored the relative strength of the economy, citing the solid labor market conditions, 4.2% unemployment rate, a low inflation rate, and improvements in business and consumer sentiment. Just quickly back to your oil prices statement regarding the war in Iran and war in the Middle East. We're old enough to have lived through wars in the Middle East that really messed with gas prices. But the United States produces a lot more oil now than it did 20 years ago when the war in Iraq. So, does that mean that, and I'm not saying that it's only U.S. consumers that should be concerned about the price of oil, but does that mean that supply could be less directly impactful to consumers here? Or is that too simple to be true?
It's too simple to be true. Oil is, as we know, a liquid market. But in fact, the United States oil industry has not been doing very well recently because oil prices are so
cheap,
low, right? And so it's not cost effective for them to actually keep drilling for oil. This could actually help the United States oil industry quite a lot, but they would be fools to charge anything less or that is substantially less than the going market rate for oil, right? They want to maximize their profit. They'll charge just as much as they can, just like any other business.
Right. And I suppose the component that the oil market is a futures market is the real kind of the reason that's too simple to be true in another sense.
That's right.
Okay. No more questions, Professor. That's all I got for this week.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
There's a lot going on.
Yes. Well, next week there'll be a NATO summit, and so we'll be covering that.
Do we still have NATO? Or is that?
Yes, we do.
They didn't cancel NATO? That's still on television?
But, maybe Trump will leave early again. And so
they're hoping he will.
Yes, we'll be covering that, and as well as whatever other developments occur in the Middle East and elsewhere.
Okay. He's Sam. I'm John. Have a great solstice, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Happy summer.
See you next week.